Hello, everyone. As mentioned, my name is Julian Pileggi. I am here to talk to you about how to make use of your SIM. And before I get into that, I'll talk to you a bit about who I am, and we'll also talk about maybe a bit of best practices on how to use a SIM. I think, though, the meat of the content will be probably near the end when we talk about some SIM rules that I think are pretty valuable and that you should consider implementing if you have a SIM and you're trying to get some value out of it and you're getting flooded with a lot of noisy alerts. I think what we're going to talk about near the end is going to be maybe some higher accuracy, hopefully less noisy events that will give you some value. So like I said before that, my name is Julian Pileggi. I'm a senior consultant with Mandiant in the Toronto office. I've been with Mandiant for about 2.5 years now. Prior to that, I worked in a large bank in Canada doing security operations, investigations, and incident response. So obviously working with the SIM in a SOC is kind of part of your day-to-day. I've got experience with ArcSight, QRadar, Splunk, a bunch of other types of SIMs. So I've got a pretty varied breadth of experience with different technologies. And this talk is not really going to be about a specific technology. It's more just about SIM in general. I also talked at BSides Charm this year, and I trained or presented a training at Black Hat and MIRCON, or FireEye CDS as it's known now. And if you guys will be at Sector, you might see me again, or at Black Hat Europe. Fun fact about me, I can type on average 120 words per minute. I probably won't speak that fast, or at least I hope I won't. But yeah, I can probably also type as fast as 165 words per minute. Actually, it's recorded, not probably. So if anyone wants to challenge me, feel free to do that after the presentation. Disclaimer though, everything that I will be talking about today is coming from me. It's not really representative of maybe FireEye or Mandiant. I mean, a lot of it will be very similar, but keep that in mind. Take everything with a grain of salt. And also understand that everyone's organizations are unique. Situations are different. What I suggest or might say is good or is best practice may not really be suitable for your organization or for your situation. So you have to take that into consideration, of course. So like I said, we're going to start off with some best practices. And we're first going to talk about logging. I'm not going to get into this in any depth. Really, this is very high level. But the idea here is the kinds of logs you need to make sure you have in your SIM. This is a laundry list of things I put together based on the kinds of things I think are useful from my investigations or the experience that I've had, right? When I see these kinds of logs, there's a lot of value that you can get from them, certain things you can look for in them. Probably one that I'll point out to you is PowerShell ×3. The reason I say ×3 is because, of course, if you have upgraded to at least version 5 of PowerShell, you can enable all 3 logging: script block logging, transcription logging, and module logging. Highly recommend that you make sure you have all those 3. Very useful, of course, with all of the various PowerShell frameworks for post-exploitation activities that are used by attackers and red teams alike. On the right side, I've got some things that are nice to have. Sysmon op logs. This is a shout out to Kenneth, who did a pretty sweet training this week on how to deploy Sysmon to your environment and monitor and look in those logs using Splunk, which is pretty sweet. So that brought a bit of attention to my mind in that sense. But I think a lot of these are arguable, right? Some of these you might say, yeah, we think these are very valuable, and some you might disagree with. That's totally fine. This is just my opinion. And a couple of other things I think that are very valuable that people don't always consider. Metering data. Here I've put SCCM. That's one capability or one tool that you can use for metering data. People don't think of metering data as a security tool or like security information, because it's not really, but it keeps track of information about what's happening in your environment, and you can get some really good stuff out of it. Like, for example, applications that have been used. If the meter is just monitoring how long the application was running, the fact that it was running, maybe that will give you an indicator of compromise for a backdoor or something. Done with logging, we're going to talk a bit about tech specs. The specifications you should strive to ensure that you have in your SIM or the platform that you're using as a SIM. And I've only got one slide on it, which is not too bad. Again, I said it's very high level, but I think there's one thing on this slide that's going to make most people's head explode. But most of it, I think, is what you would expect, right? You ideally want to have some kind of backup situation. So primary and secondary, if you can, redundancy. A lot of organizations, they don't consider a SIM or a lot of security tools as high availability, as tier 1, right? And depending on the size of your organization, maybe that's reasonable, but realistically, if your monitoring team or your ops team is unable to monitor the environment because your SIM is down, it can be pretty serious. The second thing I want to point out here is that your test environment, you should have a test environment to test your code, test rules, test changes to the SIM. You should actually have a full copy of your production data in your test environment. And a lot of people say that's not right? Because normally test environments should not have production data. However, in the case of a SIM, if you don't have real production data, you're not actually testing anything, right? You maybe are testing your ability to type the keys into the computer and see if you can do it in a test environment, but it's not going to really validate whether there's a performance impact. It's not going to tell you if you actually will catch what you're expecting to catch. So you really need to make sure you have a copy of your prod data in that test environment specifically for the SIM. Role-based access control, that's a basic feature I think that everything's got. Automated aggregation by distinguishers. This I think is probably pretty standard, but the idea here is that you want to be able to aggregate alerts coming from the SIM based on specific distinguishers by alert. So each alert might have a different distinguisher, right? Of course, if you have a SIM rule that triggers on suspicious emails, the distinguisher might be the sending email address versus an IP address from a network kind of correlation rule. Geolocation enrichment is huge. If you don't have this in your SIM, it's actually very, very important that you have this. Geolocation enrichment can be as simple as getting like a MaxMind or IP2 location database, hooking it up to your SIM, so anytime there's a publicly routable IP address, the information associated with that address can be kind of added to the metadata for that event, and then you can use that to actually create correlation rules, and we'll see a couple of examples of that later on. Now here at the bottom is where I think a lot of people sometimes have a hard time swallowing this pill, and that's 30 days retention is what you should strive for across all of the logs that you centralize in your SIM. It can be very difficult, can take a lot of storage, but of course it's very necessary, and I'll explain why in just a second. But before we get to that, the second point is that you should be able to query at least the last 2 weeks of your data for a specific atomic indicator within 60 seconds. And you'll notice I'm not telling you need 256 gigs of RAM or 5 terabytes of storage. I'm not telling you that because that doesn't really matter. It depends on your environment and the kind of logs you're storing. What you need to strive for is the actual usability, right? And so that's a measurement that I think a lot of people can sometimes get to, sometimes they don't. I've had this reaction a lot of times where people say, what? I should be able to do this in 60 seconds. It's not possible, right? But the reality is if you aren't able to get access to the information in your SIM, it's going to make it much more difficult to actually perform effective monitoring and investigation and perhaps incident response if you ever need to do that. And it is doable. I mean, this is an example of a query I pulled for the last 2 weeks. I had to make sure it was doable before I said this publicly. But, it is doable. In this case, the query took 16 seconds. Other times I've tried it, it takes 30, 40 seconds. But the idea is if you're looking for a specific indicator, atomic indicator, not a complex expression, you should be able to get the information relatively quickly. In one organization that I saw this issue, they had intel that said that they were being targeted, and they needed to validate whether the specific threat group had actually made any communication with their network. Very straightforward. Here's 5 IP addresses used by the threat actor. We know they're targeting you. Check your logs and see if you've had any connections. They said, yeah, we've got a SIM, we've got 30 days, no problem. Except when they went to query it for 30 days, they realized that the SIM was under-scoped, and it was actually going to take about 7 days to pull the data and see if they could actually query all their firewall logs. Right? So obviously not going to be very useful in that time frame. And this is the point I was referring to earlier, is that dwell time, the amount of time that an attacker is inside an environment before they're typically identified by an external party or by the team at the organization, is a median of 99 days. This information is pulled from the Mandiant M-Trends report that they release every year. It's based on all of the cases they worked on in the previous year. So 99 days was the median number last year in 2016. And it's been going down, which is good. But again, if an attacker's in your environment for 99 days, you probably need at least 30 days of data, right? A couple of weeks, it's not going to cut it. The longest case that I've heard about where an attacker was in an environment was actually over 2,000 days, right? So that's 5+ years that an attacker was in an environment. So in that case, I don't think the SIM was going to help them too much. Now we're going to talk about staffing. Again, very high level. The reason I talk about staffing is because you need to know how to appropriately staff, one, the SIM and the management of the SIM, but also the staff that actually will use the SIM, right? Because if you don't have users of a SIM tool, there's no value to it because you can't just plug it in and turn it on. It's not like a detective, or rather it is a detective. It's not a preventative measure, right? It's not going to just prevent attacks. So this is my kind of thought process on a mature blue team. Whatever you want to call it, I'm going to call it a blue team. Right? Typically, you'll see 3 tiers within a mature blue team. You have a tier 1, right, or an L1. Those are the folks who are doing the day-to-day monitoring, the initial alert assessment, triage, contextualization. And the idea here is at the L1 level, someone should be able to look at an alert coming from the SIEM and within 15 minutes make a decision about whether this is a false positive or it needs to be escalated for further investigation, right? Potential incident. At that point, of course, then you have your L2 or level 2 tier. Those are the folks who will be typically doing that investigation, that analysis. You'll notice I put threat intelligence there. That typically is a separate group of folks who are probably providing input into the tier 2 and tier 3 teams, as well as your hunt team if you get to that level of maturity. And then, of course, the tier 3, you can see tier 3's got your L3 team. Those are typically like very skilled folks, right? Maybe your forensics guy, your malware reverse engineer, if you have that. Not a lot of organizations end up getting to tier 3. Again, hunt team also, that tier 3 level, that's very mature level of an organization. Not everyone gets to that, and that's something you probably want to strive for. But the key star, the key player for us today is this group over here, right, that I've pointed out, the automation and content development group. And you'll see I put them kind of somewhere between 2 and 3 because they're working really with that tier 2 and tier 3 folks to ensure that the content is being developed for the SIEM as effectively as possible. Now, you see a little number beside each of these teams. That little number is a proportion. It's not hard and fast, but it's a recommendation. So if your team was comprised of this number of people, you should have 4 at the level 1, and the ratio is then 3 at level 2, 2 at level 3, etc. If you have a smaller team, that can go down to 2 and 1 and 1 and so forth. But as I mentioned, the lowest maturity or kind of, where everyone kind of starts from, you probably are just going to start off with level 1s and 2s. That makes sense. That's probably where we are at for most people. You then expand, and the key here is after you've got your initial monitoring capabilities down, you then expand immediately into automation and content development. Right, so a lot of times folks leave automation and content development, so that's the SIEM development, that's the people who are tuning and creating rules for a SIEM and possibly other capabilities or technologies as well. That's where you want to fit them in this kind of second stage. Of course, after that, you probably want to expand out to get a threat intelligence team or a couple of threat intel analysts, again, depending on the size of your organization and the needs that you have. And lastly, you then get to threat hunting, which is a great topic that we won't discuss today, unfortunately. So recap on a full mature blue team. And again, the reason I talk about this is because the technology itself is not sufficient. I'm going to tell you about some SIEM rules that are super cool. But if you don't have anyone who can actually implement these properly, and if you don't have anyone who can actually investigate them properly, it doesn't matter. So a lot of times it's important to understand that you need the right resources and you need to use them correctly in order to effectively leverage what you're doing with your security program. Now, when you're trying to staff a security content development team or security automation team, of course, you probably want dedicated resources if you can. 1 or 2 is probably sufficient. 3 is ideal. Typically, they need to have a little bit of software dev background and some IR or security operations background. Red team is also perfectly acceptable. The idea here is they need to understand what attackers do, what attackers might try to do, what attacks look like, attacker TTPs, techniques, tactics, and procedures. They're probably going to get this information from the threat intel feeds or group anyways, but they still need to have a good understanding of what it is if you want to make effective detection for it. Because a lot of times, people try to develop SIEM content, and if they don't really understand the attack or why the attack works or the details of it, they might tune it in a way that it won't be effective any longer without realizing it. So programming skills, of course, and maybe some signature skills, signature writing skills like regex is a very basic way of writing patterns. Snort SIGs, YARA, IOCs, there's a number of different capabilities. As long as you have a little bit of an understanding of how to do that, you should be fine. Now we're going to get into content management, how you manage and develop this content. This will be a bit more interesting, I think, and then we're going to get into the SIEM rules. which is what I expect most people are most interested in today. Of course, the use case development cycle looks pretty much like any development cycle, right? You need to have an idea, starting off with the plan, of what you're trying to detect. What are you trying to detect or correlate upon? And that's typically, like I said, maybe going to be some input coming from your intel team. It could be input from the hunt team. If you have a threat hunting team and they've identified something that your controls do not currently detect, that would be a great input. Alternatively, it could also be from, anyone in the security organization who's got a good idea of something to detect. You then develop some pseudocode or logic, try to identify which tools and log sources you'll need. And then you need to implement that, of course, in probably test first, then production. We'll talk a bit about more of that. And once it's implemented and you know that it's tuned effectively, that's when you can operationalize it and actually have people start monitoring it. And the biggest mistake a lot of people make is they implement and they don't tune before they operationalize. And so what you end up having is, of course, a security monitoring team or, security analysts who are basically overloaded. And they're flooded with alerts, and it's impossible for them to really assess and evaluate all the alerts. And then they end up missing something that was really obvious, and the organization might get breached. And then later they go back and say, well, you had, an alert that told you, but if there's 1,000 alerts a day, it's not really reasonable for anyone to actually expect them to catch everything. Now, when you're developing use cases, or use cases is kind of like the term for correlation rules in a SIEM. And that's the term that folks use. So when you're developing use cases, when you're making a library of use cases, these are the kinds of things you probably want to track, right? You need to have, of course, a unique name and number, so you can reference that specific use case or correlation rule. You probably want to assign it some kind of category personally. I like to assign categories that are associated with the attack lifecycle or the kill chain. Right? Mandiant FireEye has our own attack lifecycle. There's a Lockheed Martin kill chain. Whichever you use, I think it's good. It's a good way to approach the categorization. Severity, of course, is subjective. A description should be enough to explain to someone who's reading what this use case should detect or this rule should detect. So they don't actually need to read, the logic behind it. They should be able to get a good understanding from your description. You, of course, do want to have some pseudocode involved, right? So you've got to think about that a little bit. And the stuff we're going to see today, I have 22 correlation rules we're going to go through, and I've written pseudocode for each of those. And you can take that pseudocode and then try to implement it. And the reason we use pseudocode is because it's technology agnostic, right? You then have to adapt it for your technology and also for your environment, depending on what logs you have, what log sources you might be using, etc. Log source requirements I mentioned before, very straightforward. What do we need to make this accomplish this? Associated reference lists. This is data that you need to populate when you're first creating your SIEM or when you're trying to make correlation rules effective. This might be something like a list of all the server host names, a list of all the workstation host names, a list of all of the usernames associated with your IT administrators, etc. These types of lists that you may want to reference in correlation rules later on. And lastly, something that a lot of people leave out of their library or use case database is test scripts. That's just a step-by-step of how you actually trigger this alert for real, not in the theory, and then you will actually execute that test script. And this is how you make sure that the SIEM is doing what it's expected to do. So for the actual development portion, as I mentioned, you probably want to start off with user acceptance testing, right? UAT, that's the test environment. And here, after you've gone from UAT, it goes into the tuning phase, and that's a back and forth process between tuning and production implementation. So when we get into that UAT implementation, of course, you're just testing to make sure whether the logic works, and preferably you've got your production data in there so you can actually see the kind of performance impact that's going to happen on your SIEM once you start this rule. Could be very high impact depending on what you've written at the thresholds you've set. But once you're feeling comfortable with that, you need to tune it a little, right? Every organization will have false positives. The pseudocode I'm going to show you, I guarantee if you just try to copy paste this into your own organization, there's going to be some false positive that I've never heard of, that nobody even considered was even possible, and it's going to be in your organization. So tuning is very, very important. And then, of course, the production implementation should be the easiest part. That's basically just taking the content you developed in your UAT, you've already tested and tuned, and you just plop that into prod. And that can be, of course, done through change management easily. This is the hard part that can't be done through change management easily, and that's daily tuning. Again, another thing that a lot of people say, not possible. And in some places, it's really hard to do that. But that is what you should strive for. That is the ideal situation, is that you should be tuning rules and events on a daily basis in your SIEM, which is, of course, why you need dedicated staff and resources to do that. It's not really reasonable to expect a team that's already got a number of other things on their plate to be doing daily tuning of the SIEM as well. Now, I mentioned that test script. This is an example of one of the test scripts you might use for a use case or a correlation rule that detects malware detected on a domain controller. Very simple, not very cool, but obviously, how do you test this? Well, let's create an ICAR file. If you're not familiar with an ICAR file, this is a file that will be detected by all antivirus solutions. However, it is not malicious. It's just a plain text string. I believe 68 characters is the minimum you need for the ICAR. And it's a specific set of characters written right here. You can find this online. Save the file in your domain controller. Validate, yes, we saw the alert. Validate, yes, the antivirus cleaned this off. Very straightforward, but you actually need to create scripts for everything in your use case database. Now, that use case database or the library itself is one building block from many. And these building blocks all connect in this way. They're all correlated. I'm going to show you actually how you could fit these together and how they should be fit together. But the idea here is that you have your use case library or database as a center of what you're doing for security monitoring, right? These are the things you're looking for. This is how you're monitoring and what you're monitoring for. That ties into an investigations tracker, some central database where you can track the investigations and alerts that are coming out of your tools, whether they're coming from your SIEM or somewhere else, but probably from your SIEM. So your alert, right, feeds into that investigations tracker. The tracker references the use case database or the use case library. So if an alert fires, your analyst should be able to click on the alert name and read the use case library entry with all of the details that we discussed previously, all of those fields, so that they can get context on what's going on. That use case library is then tied into the alert playbooks or alert tasks. This is the actual steps you should take. So having a SIEM and having monitoring is great, but then you need to know what to do once something triggers. So that's what we call alert playbooks. This is different than an incident playbook, right? This is more what you do before you know there's an incident. You just have an alert. You have to validate, is this alert actually representative of an incident or something we need to investigate further? Or is it a false positive that we're going to queue up for daily tuning? And the last piece is your threat intelligence database. Whether this is simply just feeds coming from some sticks and taxi feeds, or it's an actual team that's kind of preparing briefs for you, you also want to have that tied in so that you can have that connection with your use cases and your alerts. So that, again, the context is there in one place. The purpose of a SIEM is that central pane of glass. So you don't want to have people having to go to different resources if you can avoid it, or at least make it as easy as possible. This is an example of what you might have at a very high level of the use case library names. These may not be that valuable. I made these up based on things that we've seen before or correlation rules we've used before. But the idea is more on the right side here, those tasks. The alert tasks should be defined, and these will be procedural tasks that your organization would do on a regular basis. These are things you can document to a T. Every single time someone needs to get information about a specific source IP address, it's going to be the same every time in your organization. The goal here is you can standardize what you're doing, you can make it more efficient, and you potentially could actually automate a lot of this in the future, right? Using security orchestration tools. That's the new buzzword for automation, right? Here's an example of what you might see for the alert playbook for an EXE being downloaded from an uncategorized website. Very straightforward. There are 6 tasks that need to be done. These tasks can be done within 10 minutes. They could even be automated, and then all it takes is someone to review the information that they've collected from the collection tasks and then make a decision about whether this is a false positive or true positive. Now we're going to give you an example of an actual use case library. This is one of many that you could have. In this particular case, there are a couple of thousand use cases in this library, which is pretty extensive. But the idea, again, being that you have a rule, name, some other information associated with you. I'm going to show you details of those informations that you could collect, but the way that this interlocks with the other components, right? So here you can see we've got a rule database. I can go in and I can read about these rules and I can understand what they are if I so choose. However, as I mentioned before, that investigations tracker is where the alerts will come into. So an alert should spawn in your SIEM that should automatically generate a case for investigation. So when that generates a case in your investigations tracker, you come with something like this, right? A series of alerts, the case that's been generated, and you'll notice the name is correlated with something from the use case database that we just saw, or those rules that we saw in the previous slides. Maybe I'll zoom in a bit here. Yeah. So you can see alert generated. This is in my investigations tracking database. Now I can actually go in and I can action these alerts. And I can immediately see a summary from that use case database entry. Now, this is pretty small. Maybe I'll zoom it in a little more here. Is that easier? Okay. So you can see that that summary information is right there available. That's what you need to strive for. You need to strive for having this integrated with your SIEM so that as soon as the alert fires, a case is created. The case references the information in the use case database so that the analyst or investigator can immediately read the description and, in this particular case, the actual query that's being used to trigger the alert. Now, this is a big problem with a lot of maybe proprietary IDSs, for example. They never want to tell you why they detected something. And that makes it really difficult to understand how to investigate it. We don't have those limitations with a SIEM because there are tools, we own them. So it's very valuable to make sure that your analysts can actually read the contents of your rules so they know how and why it triggered. This is a rule that detects 1 to 2 character executables being downloaded. Not really very high fidelity, probably lots of false positives, but it catches some malicious things every so often as well. So as I mentioned before, you want to make sure you have that summary available immediately, and once somebody accesses that, they can read the full details, right? So here you can see there's more details inside. For example, the confidence level, severity, any notes, the specific distinguishers. It's very difficult to see, I know. I think I have a blown up version in a couple slides, but here's another one. For example, Dridex, Trojan. Dridex is a malware family that has a specific SSL certificate that it uses, and there's a pattern that you can detect. May not be relevant anymore. These kinds of things change all the time, but the idea here is, again, you have this information easily accessible, and when clicking on the alert, because these are tied together, right, you get that same information automatically populated in the alert details from the use case database, and you can see here that the threat intelligence database is also correlated as well. Here's a link to whatever threat intelligence is related to this specific alert. I'll show this for one more second. Okay, now the threat intelligence database, as I mentioned, ideally you want to have that integrated so that you can see how all these components are all in one. We haven't gone anywhere else. This is the goal that you need to strive for. Not always doable, but that's what you want. So let's see how this looks. If I click on this use case alert, the alert brings me to my description. The description has a link to my threat intelligence. The threat intelligence that allows me to read about this specific threat and say, okay, what is this? What are the kind of things I should be looking for? Are there any other relevant materials on this threat intelligence portal that I might be interested in? The last piece, as I mentioned before, are the alert tasks. The alert tasks are what you need to do when an alert fires. Now, in this particular tool I've been showing you, which I haven't even mentioned what it is, it doesn't matter. In this tool, they call it guided investigation. The point is you need to have a definition of specific things someone should do when an alert fires. Here is an example of what this specific rule is customized for. Right? This rule says these are the things you should check when this alert fires. The analyst goes in, evaluates these things, and then makes their determination. Do I escalate this, or do I suppress this? Do I close this? Now we're going to get into the actual SIEM rules. As I mentioned, there are 22 rules we're going to discuss. These are mostly high fidelity. Some of them I'll talk about maybe have a little bit of a lower level of confidence, but I'll explain why I included them, and we'll have pseudocode as well. I've made a bit of my own syntax highlighting, and again, the pseudocode is just something that I came up with. It's not going to be something you can implement immediately, but should be fairly easy to understand for most folks who have a bit of background with computers or Boolean logic. So the first one we're going to start off with, very straightforward. And some of these actually might seem like they're really obvious to you. There are some people who haven't heard of these before, but this one is very straightforward. This is successful remote authentication via a Tor exit node. Now, a lot of people say, why do I care about Tor? Well, they're thinking about probes from Tor. Probes from Tor, I agree. If someone's just scanning me from a Tor exit node, I probably don't care that much. I might be a little interested, but I'm really interested if someone successfully logs in from a Tor exit node. So you can see the pseudocode here. My event source is specified in this particular case as VPN or Citrix, right? So my remote access utilities. If there's an authentication success event and the IP address is in a list that I'm pulling on the hour for Tor exit nodes, then I want to alert. And you'll see the dependency here is, of course, we need some kind of tool or ability to actually pull the Tor exit node list, which is public. Here I recommend hourly. And I've put a little bit of a legend here. All of the field names will be in blue, values in red. If there's a function or some kind of operation, that's going to be in green. And if there's a list that we're referencing, so kind of reference list I mentioned before, those will be in yellow. Now, the second one we're going to talk about, again, this might be something you think is a no-brainer, very straightforward, but some folks don't really pay attention to antivirus alerts because the antivirus is meant to automatically detect and clean things, right? And that's its job, and that's what it does, and folks don't really read or look at the antivirus alerts, and that totally makes sense. However, I think there are some situations where you probably do care. For example, if there's malware detected on a critical server, like your domain controller. If there is ever a malware detected in your domain controller, even if it's adware, it's still worth investigating. How did that end up on your domain controller? There's zero reason for you to not investigate, regardless of what it is. Here you also notice I've actually excluded something from a specific list of servers, the Citrix XenApp servers, right? Because users have profiles on those, and they might be browsing using Citrix XenApp, if you're familiar with that. Kind of gives them like a remote access portal, and they can use virtualized, I guess not virtualized, but segregated applications on the Citrix server. So of course that might be a server you're not really caring about malware being detected from the application data folder, because that's very common, and you'll probably get a lot of adware false positives as users are browsing, or maybe some JavaScript files that are detected. The next one we're going to talk about is common credential theft file names. This is super easy for an attacker to avoid. All they need to do is rename their malware or their credential theft utility to something else. But the reality of the situation is in that probably about 30 to 40% of the cases I've worked on, we see the credential theft malware simply renamed one of these file names. I mean, that's my personal experience, may not be yours. But the situation of the fact of the matter is that the attackers are kind of lazy, and so if this is the tool name, they're probably going to just drop it like that. So the ability to actually look for that, this is a fairly comprehensive list, of course, is going to be very useful. Like I said, though, attacker, all they have to do is rename their tool. It's not going to be triggered on or not detected. And actually, there's something we're going to detect for that later as well. Now, this one's a little bit more of a behavioral rule. Rule number 4. This is a web server acting a little unusually. And what I mean by that, and maybe I could have named this a little better, is that the actual web server process. So if you're using IIS web server application, which is a web server application for Windows, the web server process is typically either w3wp.exe, that program, that is the IIS web server application. And on older versions, I think prior to IIS version 6, which hopefully nobody's still running, right? Okay. You might also see this as the application name, right? ASP.NET_WP. So those two executables are not malware. Those are your IIS servers. But if those processes are the parent, or they spawn another process, it's not maybe that common or that usual unless there's evidence of attacker activity. For example, if an attacker has found a vulnerability in your website, they may start leveraging a web shell that they've uploaded into your website or on your web server to perform some other operations, and those operations might include some of these commands. So a very straightforward one to look for. Again, you might have to check to see if this is actually happening. Your web server may have custom code that your developers have made, and they may be running some of these commands as part of the web server application. So validate that, check that. With all of these rules, again, as I mentioned, everyone's environment's different. You need to take these with a grain of salt. You're not going to be able to copy-paste these directly into your environment. There's probably going to be something that happens, and that's unique for you that other people don't see. Now, this next one is a suspicious service installation. And I'm going to actually show you an event, a service installation event right after this, so you can see why I picked some of these keywords. But the idea here is you're looking for service installation events, which is the 7045 EID, right? So in the Windows event log, 7045, and you'll notice here I've put service name matches and this weird expression, right? If you're not familiar with that, that's called regular expressions, or regex. And that expression, or that series of symbols, essentially represents a 16-character string that is composed entirely of A to Z characters of either case. No spaces, no special characters, no numbers. Okay, I'll explain why that is in a second. And then, of course, also we're looking for whether it contains some of these keywords like PowerShell, CMD, Base64, IEX, and ComSpec. And the reason is because the default service installation done by Metasploit looks like this. So you can see that the name or service name that Metasploit will use in a default installation, and I don't think most people are changing this, is a randomized 16-character string. I don't believe I've seen one that has numbers or spaces, which is why I wrote the expression to look for upper or lowercase characters. It's always exactly 16 characters long. Straightforward, very low-hanging fruit. If you can't detect it or you're not looking for it, you should be able to. And then you'll notice some of these other keywords that I also highlighted. Those are the specific strings that I looked for in this rule. Because of course, if a service is installed on my system, but that service is responsible for simply running PowerShell, that doesn't sound like a service that I've probably installed on purpose. Same with command prompt, cmd.exe. If you're not familiar with this IEX is how PowerShell can be used to execute specific things. Invoke execution, I believe. So that's used to execute things. So I've added that in as well. Because if a service, again, is being installed in your system and it's executing something using PowerShell, it doesn't really sound like an actual system service that you would normally be installing. The next one we're going to talk about is the download function from PowerShell. PowerShell has, I think, 10, 15, maybe more ways to download things from the internet. And at the bottom, you'll notice I put actually this name and this talk that I saw at DerbyCon, Daniel Bohan, and actually another Mandy consultant. He can explain to you why this rule is not going to be the greatest, because he's created this thing that is called Invoke Cradle Crafter, and he's basically made a way to obfuscate PowerShell in a way that it's almost impossible to detect. But this will catch low-hanging fruit. PowerShell scripts running in your environment that are downloading files should be very rare, with the exception of specific scripts that are being run by your sysadmins. And that's something that you can easily observe, identify, and whitelist. But otherwise, pretty much all of those functions start with the keywords .download or openread. And you'll notice here I've actually have a green function. I mentioned these functions earlier. This function is meant to split or strip special characters, because when attackers try to obfuscate their commands, they'll put in things like tick marks or quotation marks. And funnily enough, PowerShell will actually allow you to write the word PowerShell, if you want to execute PowerShell, with a bunch of tick marks separating each character, right? So that might destroy your detection if you're simply looking for the word PowerShell, or vice versa. If they want to put those tick marks between every letter of the word download, if you're simply looking for .download and you're not stripping out those special characters, you're going to fail to catch that. So it's very important to try and strip out special characters if you're doing this kind of detection. Otherwise, your likelihood of catching more advanced attackers is going to be very low with this one. But it will probably catch a lot of commodity stuff or some of the more basic frameworks. The next one we're going to talk about is attempted exploitation detected. This requires your vulnerability scan data. Is everyone doing vulnerability scans every so often? Yeah? Hopefully you should be. You should be doing it probably quarterly or maybe more frequently if you can. But the idea here is once you've got that scan data, I mean, a lot of people use that scan data for patching. You go, you patch your systems, and you say, that's great. Or sometimes you say, well, you know what? We're going to prioritize only the critical ones. We're going to leave all these other ones unpatched. It happens a lot, right? Has anyone heard of that before? Yeah. Not ideal, but it definitely happens. So the idea here is if you have this data and you know your systems are unpatched to specific CVEs, you can actually correlate that with IDS alerts, because your IDS alerts should also have a CVE. So again, you're looking for an IDS alert correlated with a specific host that you know to be vulnerable with that CVE. And that could, and likely does, indicate that someone has done some reconnaissance. They've already identified what application is running on that server or system that they're trying to exploit, and they're actually running an exploit that has a very high likelihood of being successful. Right? And that means that someone is specifically interacting with your environment, and the likelihood of that being a random scan is a little bit lower. That being said, of course, it's entirely likely if you're running unpatched software exposed to the internet, you're probably going to get people trying to exploit you with everything all the time. This is probably better to limit to your internal network, your internal servers that are not internet facing. The next rule we're going to talk about, I actually hate this kind of rule, and I only included it so I could specifically tell you one thing about it. A lot of organizations, they like to say, let's detect brute force, and usually the threshold I see is like 3 failed logins in 5 minutes or something really low. And like I said, I'm not a huge fan of this because I really don't see a lot of value coming out of it. But if you have to implement this, and for whatever reason you think it's really great, up your threshold as much as you can. Right? We had, in one organization, we had this 3 failed logins in 5 minutes. It basically just detected every Monday morning everyone forgetting their password on Monday morning. That's all it was really good for. And I think we did about 1,000 investigations, and 0 of them were ever actual evidence of activity that was malicious or even someone doing something bad. Right? So that's a lot of spent effort on something that wasn't really great. We up the threshold, and if we up it to 200 in 24 hours, all of those, just user error things go away. What you're left with is 2 things. You're left with possible brute force. That's going to be probably 1 in 10. 9 times out of 10, you're going to find that a sysadmin has written a script and he's hard-coded credentials, and the credentials have changed, and now his script is hammering some server trying to use the old credentials. Not really a security issue from the perspective of someone breaching your organization, but it kind of is a security issue from the perspective of you now have identified a sysadmin as hard-coded plaintext credentials into a script, and that has some value to finding and fixing, of course. Now this one is good, and actually I've considered even just making this service installation in general. But if you have services being installed just at all on your critical servers, you probably should be detecting that. Again, 7045 EID, like we saw before, very straightforward. All you really need is a reference list of your critical servers and your event logs. Pretty easy to check and compare. The reality is, once your servers are set up, domain controller is deployed, you're probably not installing new services to it very often. The only people doing that are likely going to be attackers. Except, of course, if you have an approved change window where you're actually deploying new applications, then that makes sense that you might have that. Now, earlier I showed you a bunch of file names that were related to credential dumping malware. But of course, as I said, attacker can simply change the file name and your detection is now moot. So the alternative, it's really not a great alternative, but I'll explain why I put this in here, is going with antivirus signatures. And in this particular case, the AV solution that I looked at, it names all of the credential theft malware with the prefix hacktool dot. So rather than trying to figure out all the credential theft malware names, I simply use that expression or that pattern, substring, to look for detection of these hack tools. And that captures hack tools, credential theft malware. And the reason I included this, because this is kind of lame, right? Antivirus detected it. Why do I care? So I can see why you might think this is kind of lame. But if someone is already in your environment and dropping hack tools, even if it's cleaned, what happens immediately, and I've seen this with real attackers, here's what happens. They drop the hack tool, it gets cleaned off. Antivirus wipes it away, everyone ignores it. The attacker changes 1 byte in the file, brings it back in, antivirus doesn't detect it, continues on his way. That has basically slowed him down for about 30 seconds. But for us, it's a great indicator, right? And there are not, so many cases that I've worked on where we come in and we see the antivirus actually had detected the attack tool, but it was cleaned, and so no one really paid attention to it. But that was a great early warning. Now this one is a cool one. We saw an APT threat actor actually doing this, and folks were talking, I think, about O365 earlier, right? So webmail or accessible email from the internet, especially in cloud hosting providers. We actually saw an APT organization or a group who gained access to the cloud or O365 mail system for a specific organization. And what they did was they had access to a couple of users, and they basically gave those users delegation rights to the entire IT security team's mailboxes. So it's about 26 or 27, if I recall correctly, users that they got access to. And what that means is then the attackers had full access to read, modify, and send mail on behalf of the security team. So as the security team was actually investigating, in this case, they didn't have an investigations tracker. This particular organization, the security team, well, they just communicated by email. The attackers were actually reading the emails and watching the investigation into them as it proceeded in real time. But again, basic way to detect this, take a look for the access rights equal full access, delegation being set on a specific mailbox. And this happens, right? An EA has delegation rights to an executive's mailbox, for example. So it happens once in a while. Here I recommended a threshold of 3 in 24 hours is where you should trigger on. Because 1 or 2 kind of makes sense, right? A new employee being set up, who has to do some work for other folks will have delegation rights assigned to them, and you don't want to bother yourself with false positives like that. Okay, we're about halfway through. We've got about, I think, 10 or 11 more. I think the numbering's messed up. Let's see. Bypass code being used. This is cool. Again, another case where we saw APT threat actors collect the paper bypass codes. So what that means is if you have a two-factor authentication deployment, and you've got that token code that changes every 30 or 60 seconds, when that is registered or enrolled, the user is given 8, typically, bypass codes that are called paper codes. This is like a file that they might download. And these codes can be used in place of a rolling token or a one-time password. Most users click on the file. It automatically downloads it to your machine if you're using something like Google Authenticator, for example, and then they forget about it. Right? So if an attacker gets access to that system, they can collect that file. Now they've got 8 token codes they can use to remotely access your environment. They don't need a soft token. So if you're looking in your multi-factor authentication logs, there's typically a specific signature or some indicator that a bypass code was used for this particular authentication. And here I thought, okay, it's possible that someone will use a bypass code, right? You've lost your phone, you got a new phone, you might want to use a bypass code to log in. So in this case, I limited this to outside of the home region of this organization. This organization, fictional, exists only in Canada and the US. So if someone uses a bypass code from anywhere outside of that, I want to know about it. Why? Again, because we saw an APT threat actor do this from a country that was outside of the home organization. This also links in with that. If a two-factor authentication token is registered outside of your home region, you might also be interested in that. Because why? When a new employee joins your company and you give them their two-factor authentication, where are they doing that from? They're setting that up in the office, maybe at home. And if your organization is based in Calgary, for example, and you don't have any employees outside of Calgary, if someone is registering a new two-factor authentication token in China, you might be interested in why that's happening. Again, that's what attackers are doing now. So what we see is that advanced attackers like to use your own existing remote access utilities, right? Because they can blend in. The traffic blends right in, and we've seen where they will actually generate their own token codes. They get access to the administration server. They'll simply create a new token, and now they can log in the same way that all your users can. So this is something that I think should be fairly easy to implement and fairly good accuracy. Now, this one is related to scheduled tasks. And scheduled tasks, of course, are part of the Windows operating system that allows specific commands or applications to be run on a regular basis or one time. They can be used on local or remote systems. So attackers like to use this for what we call remote command execution, or they might use it for persistence. But of course, if someone is using a scheduled task in a normal environment, you might not see some of these things. For example, how often do you have scheduled tasks running batch files? You might have it in your environment, actually, but if you do, it probably happens on a regular basis, and that's something that you can easily observe and tune out. That being said, it's probably not likely you have any scheduled tasks that are using regserve32 or have this keyword in here, strobj.dll. Does anyone know what that is? I've written it here in the description. That's actually called squibbly-do, which is an attack that uses this Windows signed binary to deploy whatever kind of malicious code on a system. I believe Casey Smith, sub T, on Twitter developed or was the first researcher to identify that, and he named it squibbly-do. But the idea being, if someone is doing this in your environment, you should be able to detect it. And I would actually go as far as to say you should probably be able to detect squibbly-do beyond scheduled tasks, but if someone is using these keywords in any command line argument, if you have the visibility into command line arguments, if you have like an EDR tool, enterprise detection and response tool, that would be great. Or you can probably get that out of Sysmon as well. Now, this one I can take or leave, but I thought I'd include it because it points out a couple of interesting things that I think not a lot of people are aware of. Does anybody know what an HTA file is or an MHT file is? So some folks do, some folks don't. Right? These are file types that can actually contain executable code. HTA is like an HTML application. So it might look like a web page, but it actually can contain code. MHT is a Microsoft document file and actually can be renamed as .doc if an attacker wants to. It would be opened by Word, but it actually can launch code as well. So these are a couple of things you might check for. PIF and SCR files. SCR files being screensavers. Again, another file type that can actually contain Windows executable code. Right? So, like I said, I could take or leave this one. It's not bad, but kind of interesting, at least for folks who don't know that these file extensions can actually contain executable content. Got only a few more here, so hopefully we'll get through these pretty quickly. This one is very straightforward, and I think the relevance of this one has decreased over the last few years. But as everyone's familiar with, right, WordPress sites that are not kept up to date, they might have a specific plugin. It's not, it's got a vulnerability in it, and then all of a sudden someone pops 30,000 WordPress sites. Has anyone ever heard that before or seen like a news article where X number of thousand WordPress sites has been compromised over the last X day? Yeah, so if you start seeing downloads of executables from specifically these two directories, that might indicate that this has been compromised and is being used to deliver malware. A third directory you might see is WP-content, but the WP-content directory is the content directory for the WordPress site where all of its content will reside. So if the author of that WordPress site is actually just delivering software because they're a security blog or an IT developer blog, it probably would be in that folder and you'll get false positives. 16, local account created on a server. This is straightforward, right? If someone is creating a local account on a domain joined server in your environment, again, it's probably not that common. Probably shouldn't be happening in your environment. Likely you have policies in place that say this shouldn't happen because most of your domain joined servers should be administered by domain accounts. So if someone is creating a local account, again, this could be an indicator of malicious activity. I'd say this one is probably like a 30-70. More often than not, like 70% of the time, it's like a sysadmin is just doing something that he shouldn't be doing. Not on purpose, just for whatever reason. Interactive use of a service account. This one is great. Attackers love to leverage service accounts because service accounts have access to a lot of stuff. Right? They have access to a lot of systems as well. But they're service accounts and they should be performing specific operations. In the Windows logon types, you'll see here I've specified event type 2 and 10. Event type 2 is an interactive logon as if I sat down at a computer and typed in my password. Event type 10 is a remote interactive logon, and that's the event type that you would generate if you log on using, let's say, remote desktop. Network logons, which is what a service account normally uses, that would be an event type 3. So you can write this rule in two ways, right? You can either say look for 2 and 10, or you can say just tell me any event type that doesn't match 3. Either way, again, you need to check your environment. I mean, you shouldn't have service accounts doing interactive logons unless you have some strange apps that have been deployed, but a really good one if you've got the confirmation that your organization uses service accounts appropriately. This one is a great one for detecting DNS command and control. So covert channels that attackers might use for command and control using DNS. They like to use DNS requests, and text records can contain blobs of data, so that actually allows them to transmit information more quickly. So a high volume of DNS text records from a specific system can be a great indicator that someone has deployed malware that is using DNS for command and control. Now this one is an example of a Cobalt Strike detection, and I put this here because I think this is very valuable. So the Cobalt Strike, for those of you who don't know, is an attack framework similar to Metasploit. Right? It's a commercial tool. However, the profiles that it uses to hide its traffic, the technology it uses or the technique it uses is called malleable C2. So the command and control traffic of a Cobalt Strike beacon can be changed very easily. And there are a number of profiles that the author of Cobalt Strike has published on GitHub. This is an example of Amazon's profile, and there are a number of other ones. And what the profile does is it tells the attack tool or the payload to communicate in such and such a way. Well, there are specific strings that are hard-coded in there. And actually, you'll see I have two rules on this slide. The first rule being detect any post request that has this specific string or any GET request that has this specific string in the URI. This will only work if someone uses the Amazon profile out of the box. But like I said, how often are people really fiddling with these things? Not that often, and the reality is we should at least be able to detect the ones we know about. It's kind of shooting ourselves in the foot if we don't even go for those ones that are public. This one is another one that's good. In the header host, so the request will actually be generated by the beacon payload, and it will actually specify the host as www.amazon.com, but of course the IP address that's associated with it is probably not going to be the organization of Amazon unless they're using Amazon AWS for command and control, but that's something that you have to consider. Like I said, this is one example. There's at least a dozen, I think there might be 2 or 3 dozen profiles on the GitHub that will tell you, how those specific profiles are used for Beacon to communicate back and forth, and you can look for those kinds of keywords. Now this one, okay, we're getting to the last 2 or 3. I know we're going a bit over time, my apologies. But the next one we're talking about is volume shadow copy deletion. This one is good for detecting ransomware if you didn't already know because everything's encrypted and now you're in trouble. But if you're in that situation, what happens is ransomware will like to delete your volume shadow copy so you cannot restore from backup. There is a flip side to this, and I've mentioned it in the description, but I didn't specify this as a different rule. But attackers will also like to create volume shadow copies, especially on your domain controller. So if you detect a volume shadow copy creation on your domain controller, there's a very high likelihood that the reason that copy was made is so the attacker can extract the ntds.dit file, which is the file that contains the password hashes for all of the accounts in your domain. And that file is normally locked, right? That's normally a locked file that an attacker cannot access. So they create a new volume shadow backup or volume shadow copy so that they can then extract the file and they get the most up-to-date hashes rather than using existing shadow copy. All right. This one is, again, some folks think it's a little bit lame, but the point here that I'm trying to get at is that it's important to be able to detect when a virus has been cleaned in real time versus on a scheduled scan, which means that it's been there for some time, right? You might want to know how long it's been there for, especially depending on the kind of malware. So here I've specified specific prefixes for types of malware I would be interested in knowing how long they were in my environment. For example, if someone had a, spyware on one of my servers for 5 seconds, that's a very different story than if it was there for 6 months. And we talked about that dwell time earlier, so of course that's very valuable to understand. And the last one we're going to talk about, actually I just got inspired in the last talk because someone mentioned about those golden ticket attacks or something. I think they mentioned that. But the idea here is that the Mimikatz attack tool, or the credential theft tool, Mimikatz, when it dumps tickets to a file, by default, it creates a file with the .kirby extension. As far as I know, there are no other uses for the .kirby file extension. So just being able to detect the creation of those files, again, it's a baseline to be able to possibly detect the activity of ticket dumping. I don't know why I wrote token dumping. It should be ticket. And anyways, so this is to detect that past the ticket attack, because of course an attacker will try to dump the ticket or create a forged ticket on your domain controller, and then they will use that in your environment to move throughout the organization. That comes to the conclusion of the content I wanted to talk to you about today. Thanks everyone for your attention. If you have any questions, feel free to come and find me after.